All right, thank you for coming. So today I'm going to be covering kind of the evolution of games publishing from console to Facebook and now to mobile. And then also what to look for as you're talking to publishers. So first, a little bit of background on me. So I've been in gaming for a while. I started in Xbox. I was there for 4 or 5 years up in Seattle managing first-party games. From there, I spent some time with Gamehouse, also up in Seattle on the casual social game side. Then I moved down to San Francisco to help start up the San Francisco office for 6 Waves, which is a social games publisher. I was there for 2.5 years and then jumped over to Gree to help manage their publishing business in North America. And then just recently, about 3 weeks ago, I jumped over to Tango. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with Tango, Tango is basically a messaging app on your mobile device. It's cross-platform, Android, iOS, similar to WhatsApp, Line, Kakao. Now, it started in 2009 as a cross-platform video and voice calling app, but from then it's since evolved to be more of a overall, I think, not just messaging app, but also content delivery system. So think social networking, communication, and also games, music, and stickers all on the same platform. Our user base is spread out pretty globally, around 30% North America, 20% Asia, 40% EMEA. Now let me jump into the topic for today then. Where's publishing been? So coming from the console world, that's really where I'm going to pull a lot of the historical elements from. So in console, PC, handheld, traditionally it's been a very capital-intensive business, right? So both in terms of development and for marketing, you needed millions and millions of dollars, especially once you get up to the AAA titles. So for example, I was working on the Halo franchise. The game itself probably cost between $30 to $50 million to develop. And then the marketing budgets for games like that will be even greater than that for a big AAA launch. A lot of the mentality for these games really was launch and forget, right? So there's this huge buildup in terms of marketing, PR, but then once the game is out there, yeah, there might be some updates to the game, there might be some add-ons, but ultimately the team has moved on, the marketing team has moved on, the product team has moved on. It's really just kind of launch and then you throw it out there. Also, these really were closed garden platforms. If you think about the platforms like PlayStation, Xbox, Nintendo platforms, in order to get on it, you needed to have relationships with those platform holders, and they were essentially the gatekeepers to the content on their platform. And then finally, retail distribution was a big part of the entire ecosystem, right? In order to actually sell the games, you had to work with, in the US, someone like Best Buy, someone like GameStop, in order to get your game into their physical stores. Now, in this scenario, the things that the publisher provided were funding for development, marketing, and PR. And again, as I mentioned before, for a AAA game, this is going to the tens of millions of dollars. Even for a minor console game, it's multiple million just to develop the game, and then multiple hundred thousand, if not millions, to market it. And also, it was important for the publisher to have those platform relationships, right? So someone like EA, Activision, Ubisoft, they knew who to talk to at PlayStation. They knew who to talk to at Nintendo. As an individual developer, it'd be challenging for you to establish those types of relationships. And similar on the retail side, right? They already have shelf space in the Best Buys, in the GameStops. Whereas for an individual developer to try to say to a huge big box store like that, hey, place our game in your shelves, it's going to be pretty challenging. And that's why, from a publisher's perspective, that's one of the big things that they provided. Now, the way that this impacted relationships and financials then is that you have the publisher providing a very large advance, right? It's broken down over milestones, but it's, let's say, a couple of million here, a couple of million there. If the developer doesn't meet a milestone, then the publisher really exerts a lot of pressure in terms of pushing that developer to perform or potentially even terminating the deal. And I've heard of multiple deals. I'm guessing those of you who have interacted with the console business, there's multiple games that really get pretty far along, and then the publisher, for whatever reason, whether it's change in people, change in strategy, the deals just get killed, right? And there's really not much that the developer can do in that case, because it really is the publisher's money which is driving a lot of this conversation. And then, in terms of the payout to the developer, Generally, it's a low royalty payout, even after full recoup by the publisher, right? So for someone like EA, they would fully recoup the development that they put into the game. They would fully recoup the marketing dollars that they put into the game. And then even at that point, it might be something like 4%, 6%, 7% in terms of the profit then to the developer. Now, what's been happening with the advent of platforms like Facebook, mobile, is that really the dynamics of the developers building these games has changed significantly. The way that the games are getting distributed has changed significantly. And so that impacts both how the publisher-developer relationship, both from a interaction standpoint, but also in terms of the financial terms, right? So the trends in the social and mobile gaming space, smaller teams, right? On the console side, you're talking about minimum 50-person teams. More likely for a AAA game, you're talking about 100 plus. Okay? Whereas for social gaming and mobile gaming, at least initially, we're talking about 5 to 7-person teams. Even now, let's say some of the bigger teams, they have 10, 15 people. Someone like a Supercell, maybe they have 20, 30, 40. Okay? But still, they're significantly smaller than on the console side. There's also lower development budgets, right? So in terms of the console world, you're talking about development cycles of 2-3 years. Whereas for most mobile games, potentially if you're fast, you can get it out in 2-3 months. I'd say generally you're still looking at a 6 to 9 month development cycle. Okay, but still, with smaller teams, with shorter development cycles come lower development budgets. Also, these platforms enable direct distribution. So on Facebook, a developer can just post the game and update it anytime they want to. On iOS, Android, similarly. Granted, on iOS, there's the review process, but still, the developer, once they've built the title, they can get it out onto the platform immediately. They don't have to go through this in-between of finding a publisher who has a relationship with the platform to get approvals and then work with a retailer to get it into the store. A significant change also is the post-launch support and live ops. So unlike the launch and forget mentality, for these games to be successful and for the best games out there, as I'm sure some of the talks have covered, you really do need to think of it as a service. You're constantly providing updates, not just big updates like once a month or once every 2 months, but the best games do it on a weekly basis, right? Whether it's a live event, so you're fighting a major boss that comes up this week, or unlocking new territories that happen, you really have to view this as a service between you and the players out there. And then also, I think something that's really impacted the gaming business is the transparency that you see for the performance of the game through the metrics. So in the console world and the PC world, once you sell the game out there, you have to track sell through, you need to track sell in, how much is going into the stores. To some degree, sales, your end sales, is your only measurement for the game, right? You can look at the Metacritic, you can look at reviews, but again, there's lag to that. And once those are out, there's really not much you can do, right? Let's say you get a bad review score. It's not like you can update the game and then put it in to stores again, right? Whereas in the social and mobile gaming world, the minute the game goes live, you can see what the metrics are. You can see what tutorial completion is, you can see how long people are spending in the game, you can see how many times people are coming back to the game that week or that day. Right, so it's immediate feedback, and the flip side is that you can immediately tweak and tune the game to improve it. Right, you can talk to others to figure out what their benchmarks are, see if you can either get that or exceed those. And then also, I think on the social and mobile side, there has been greater potential for surprises. Right, so when Angry Birds came out, when Clash of Clans came out, right, these aren't very established developers. They're essentially folks they've been working at it for a while, but it's not like the EAs, it's not like the Activisions, it's not the Ubisofts of the world that are dominating mobile and social as they have on the console world. So as a developer, of course, this is going to be more interesting because most developers think, hey, I can make a good play of it. Right. Now, the resulting changes in what the developer needs then at this point relative to what it was before, they don't need huge development budgets, right? They don't need huge marketing budgets, at least not to the scale as on the console world. So therefore, less funding is required, right? The development cycles are shorter, again, less funding required. What is important to them, though, is access to user bases, right? Especially in the free-to-play world, right? at the monetization rates that these games have, let's say between 1% to 5%, you really do need a pretty significant user base in order to generate enough revenue to support your team, even if it's a smaller team. Okay, so for a developer then, it's important that what a publisher or what they really need is not necessarily the help in building the game always, but it's the access to the players to then send into the game. Every so often you'll get a highly viral game or a game that has a great word of mouth that just blows up. But for those of you who have kind of launched the games or seen how many games are in the marketplace, it really is kind of access to that user base that a lot of developers need. And then also, especially early on, I think understanding of monetization, retention, and platform best practices, right? So free-to-play is still relatively new in most Western markets, right? In Asia, in Japan, Korea, China, because consoles weren't as prevalent, a lot of the game companies there moved into free-to-play earlier. I think even in Europe, they moved earlier than in, let's say, the US. But in terms of how to best monetize these free-to-play games, there still is a lot of expertise that I think is held amongst limited companies, right? Let's say like Agree, DNA, Kabam. A lot of developers are looking for that type of knowledge to be shared. Now, how this impacts the resulting publishing models then is that cross-promotion becomes a pretty big part of what a publisher can offer, right? So when I was at 6 Waves, we had a user base that got up to 60, 70 million MAU. So from a developer standpoint, if they could partner with someone like that, who already has a massive audience base, then that solves a lot of their user acquisition problems. Right. Also from a game and platform advisory perspective, when a developer is launching their first or second game, there definitely is a learning curve to figure out, all right, who do I talk to launch? What are the things that I have to do? What are the things that I have to put in? What are the approvals that I need? What's the best time of the week to launch? How often should I update my app? These are all kind of best practices that a publisher will be able to share with a developer. Or also, a developer could go out and either learn it through trial and error or potentially talk to other developers and gain some of this. But it definitely is a learning curve that you have to climb up. And then also is metrics-driven marketing. So what a publisher generally does now is, let's say they'll market a game, whether it's on Facebook, through the various mobile ad channels, and you can look at tracking tools like AdX, Has Offers, Kochava, but it still requires a pretty significant team in order to do this, right? And so as a developer, it's challenging unless you have significant budget, unless you do have significant engineering resources, not focused on the game themselves to kind of track and analyze all of this. So the impact that all of this has on the relationship then between the publisher and the developer is that it's definitely less entwined and less intrusive as on the console world. So in the console world, again, milestones, they can be rejected by the publisher, whereas if the publisher isn't providing a lot of funding for the game, they really don't have that much say as to what you do with the game, right? So the developer has a lot more freedom as to what features they want to put in, how often they want to update. And ultimately, it's not like the publisher can stop them from developing the game as they could in the console world. Related to that, though, is definitely the developer is taking on more risk, right? In the console world, when the publisher is providing a lot of the advances, the team's salaries are paid for, right? There's little risk in the short term as the developer is working through it. If the project gets canceled, yeah, it has a significant impact, but for many mobile and social games, if the publisher isn't providing that advance, the developer is basically taking on the full risk of funding, the salaries, and let's say the equipment of the development of the game. As a result of that, though, you do have more balanced rev shares, right? So you're not talking about 4, 6, 7% for the developer after recoup. In many cases, it's either 50-50. It might be potentially skewed a little bit towards the publisher. It might be skewed potentially a little bit towards the developer. But that's the ballpark that it'll be in, right? You're not going to have a crazy 90-10 rev share in this world. And in many of these situations, the IP is also owned by the developer, right? Because they're funding the game. Generally, the organization that's funding the game gets to hold on to the IP. Now, I'd say when I first put together this presentation, it was probably around 3 to 4 months ago. And even then, even from then to now, and looking in the not too distant future, things are changing pretty rapidly, right? So the maturation of Facebook as a platform. So when I was at 6waves, the Facebook platform was growing incredibly fast, whether due to the virality of the platform itself or because just in terms of penetration, they just hadn't hit the max in many of these countries. Whereas at this point, for most developed countries, even in the developing countries, Facebook has largely plateaued, right? And so the result that has on developers on the platform is, to some degree, it's much more challenging to grow audience bases, right? And so people are moving, therefore, that's one of the big reasons why people are moving over to mobile. Launch of new consoles, right? The new iteration of Xbox, PlayStation, Nintendo definitely gives opportunity for developers in that space to, build the next Titanfall, right? To set themselves out as, all right, we're going to be the dominant player in this platform generation. I think another thing that's been changing recently is the growth of Android. Now, maybe this isn't so much news here, but in the US really, the last couple of years has been predominantly an iOS-driven, let's say, smartphone market. But if you look at markets in Asia, if you look in Europe, if you look in Africa, South America, and even North America increasingly, Android is picking up share. And it's only a matter of time before Android passes iOS if it hasn't already. Like, for example, in Korea and China, Android has a significantly dominant market share, right, relative to iOS. Another thing that we see is TV-enabled mobile platforms. So in the US, you have things like BlueStacks, Ouya, Amazon Fire. All of these platforms, essentially, you can start to take your mobile games and feed them through their platforms and play them on your TV, right? I was over in China about a month, 2 months ago, and a lot of the people are talking about game-enabled TVs, right? So you can play without any additional hardware or software. The TVs can just play many of the Android mobile games. Right. Specific to mobile games, there have been changes also. So development budgets are rising. So over at Gree, for example, the average game probably 2 to 3 million. Okay, these were maybe 20 to 30 person teams. Okay, and granted, that's not the norm right now, but certainly you can see a near future where in order to be competitive from a production value standpoint, from a feature complexity standpoint, you really do need to match games like Clash of Clans, Modern War, Knights and Dragons. These are some of Gree's games in order to have a chance at hitting, let's say, the top 30 grossing, which is generally what you want to shoot for. Marketing budgets are also rising significantly. So early on, when games were very viral, either on Facebook or on iOS, Android, you didn't really need to spend that much on marketing. But at this point, in order to push a game to the very top, significant budgets are required. Right? So again, I can use Gree as an example, and take into account that it's at the far extreme. Right? But for a game that was performing well for Gree might spend, let's say, $1 million, $1.5 million to market it in the first month. And then from there on, every single month afterwards, they spend a few $100,000 sustaining that marketing campaign. And granted, these games monetized very, very well, retained the hardcore users pretty well, and so it justified that marketing. But that's the direction that a lot of this is going in. In order to be globally competitive for some of these mobile franchises, that's the scale at which these companies are spending. Right? Superspell is spending that much money. DNA is spending that much money. Kabam is spending that much money. Related to that is the challenges of mobile games marketing. So unlike on Facebook, when we're marketing a Facebook game, you're essentially just buying ads on Facebook, right? Now, in the mobile ecosystem, you can buy ads on Facebook also. But in addition to that, there's all these other ad channels that you have to buy through, right? Chartboost, Playhaven, Tabjoy, Flurry, AdColony. In order to integrate each one of these platforms and track the performance of all of these, you do have to work with someone like HasOffers or AdX or AppsLar, which can track the performance of those users as they come into your game. The level of time and effort it takes to integrate each one of these channels, call them up or email them to say, all right, I want to bid at a 150 CPI for this volume. It does take a decent amount of coordination and kind of overhead in order to do, which for a indie developer can be challenging. All right, so again, I'll cite Gree. Gree has a, let's say, 15 to 20 person marketing team that focuses on this type of effort. And also, related to that, sophistication of analytics, monetization, and retention methods. Okay, so you definitely, if you want to have a successful free-to-play game, you definitely want to have a person or a team that's focused on BI. Right? They're looking at, again, what the tutorial completion rates are, when people are monetizing, when people are dropping off, what are the things, what are people buying in the store, what aren't people buying in the store, what type of content is interesting, so that they can then inform the product team and the engineers, right, this is the type of things that you should continue to be building. I think Asian markets in particular have been changing very, very rapidly. And some of these characteristics are specific to Asia, but some of them also may be bleeding over to the rest of the world. So in terms of monetization, live ops, gameplay styles, say China, Korea, Japan, even when free-to-play first started, historically have monetized at better rates than Western countries. Right? So Chinese players may not monetize all that well compared to, let's say, Germany or US, but when you look at how much they're spending in these free-to-play games relative to their income levels and disposable income, it's significantly higher. And to some degree, the features that developers over in those regions have been putting in those games have just increased this further. So if you play a game like Rage of Bahamut or Knights and Dragons or Modern War, you can see that it's not just about the base game, there's also events that are constantly running. They'll switch out. Event type A, let's say it's a PvP, week-long battle with a leaderboard. Week B, it's a guild versus guild battle with leaderboards, special cards or items that help you beat the other guild. There's these events that are constantly running through and that require the live maintenance by a team. And then I think what you see, especially coming out of Japan, is creative combinations of proven gameplay, right? You take something like Puzzles and Dragons. You take match 3, you match that up with an RPG component, right? You see a lot of this, I think, innovation in terms of successful monetization and retention mechanics coming out of Japan. And so for companies like Kabam, GreeDNA, a lot of them, they'll just kind of take these proven methods and then export them to Western markets. So I'd say for serious developers, definitely check out these games, because a lot of them have already come over to Western markets, so you can see how these companies are maintaining the live operations for their titles. Another element focused in terms of Asia is the market focus for some of these companies. Right? So companies like Gung Ho, Global, Gumi, they're Japanese companies, but they're quite content to start focusing just on Japan. And once they've dominated that market, that's when they start expanding. Same thing with companies and developers in China. Those markets are inherently so big that a lot of those developers just focus on their own markets. And it's a little bit more challenging for, let's say, European developers or even North American developers, because those markets just aren't, a lot of times aren't as big. The focus needs to be more global. You're also starting to see more IP-driven, manga-driven titles over in China and Japan. I think this is a result of some of the marketing issues, right? Because it can be very expensive to try to acquire every single user, then if you have an IP on it, the IP will, to some degree, naturally draw in some users, but also when you do advertise, what the IP does is it significantly lowers your CPI, right? So the way that, let's say mobile marketing works, you're posting ads in other people's games, or you're running ads on Facebook. If you have a recognizable IP, people are more likely to click on it, your click-through rate's gonna go up, and therefore it's gonna drive down your CPI. And so that's why increasingly there is value in brands and IPs. Things are significantly different out there on Android marketplaces also, especially in China. There's some of this in Korea, less so in Japan, where because, let's say, Google Play doesn't really have a presence in China, you have 50 plus Android app stores, 360, 91, Wendojia, where each one of them have their own storefront, they have their own payment systems, and so as a developer, if you want to release broadly in China, you have to install every single one of these SDKs. You have to establish relationships with every single one of these stores. And so even for a company like Gree, like one of the things I managed at Gree also was bringing our games over to China, and these were the games that are developed in the US. Even though a 450-person team, it didn't make sense to go directly through China and integrate all of these stores. All right, so it makes it very challenging then for developers to get into China. And then finally, this is definitely related to part of my interest in joining Tango. Messenger app-driven user growth has been very significant in the Asian markets. Right? You look at Line in Japan, Kakao in Korea, WeChat in China. Because these Messenger apps have such huge user bases. So for example, Line has a user base of 210 million registered users. The ability to cross-promote those players over, and on top of that do marketing, is a significant driver of user acquisition for games on those platforms. Now, with that changing marketplace then, what a developer ultimately needs also changes. Right? So it's not as bad as the days of console, but you definitely do need increased capital for development. Right? So again, as I mentioned at Gree, it's $1 to $3 million for a title. Right? It's definitely not $20 to $30 million yet, but generally it's more capital than, let's say, a mom and pop developer can raise. Right? Also, the best practices and the science of monetization, retention, and live ops has gotten a lot more complex. And a lot of this knowledge is located in specific companies for now. I think over time, people will go off, start up their own companies, they'll get hired into some of these smaller companies. But there is a lot of science and analysis that goes behind these games at this point. And then also, I think on the marketing side, budgets and capital has increased significantly. Right? In order to market a game to the tune of $1 million, $2 million, you do need to have that piggy bank, or else your game needs to be generating a significant revenue flow in order to justify that. Again, I mentioned the marketing coordination where you have to integrate the SDKs, communicate with all these different ad vendors in order to successfully market the game. And then finally, one thing that not that many people know about, but is as critical as almost anything else in order to grow a game at scale, is how CPI growth curves and the marketing channels change. So to clarify what this is, so let's say I'm running ads. Let's use Facebook as an example. I'm running ads within Facebook, right? My initial ads, I might be able to get a relatively low CPI, let's say 50 cents, 75 cents. Because when I show that image, when I show that ad to the target user base, there's really no saturation. So it's a new image to them, they're willing to click on it, your CPI is relatively low. And if your ambitions are just to acquire, let's say, 1,000 users here, 10,000 users there, not that huge a deal. But when you're talking about hundreds of thousands of users, consistently, month on month, then the CPI start creeping up, because if you think about it, the more you show these ads to the same pool of users, the less likely they are to click. The early people are going to click, and then you have to show more ads, or you need to rotate through the ad inventory very quickly in order to get people to continue clicking and keep your CPI at a reasonable rate. And the only way you can figure out what this curve is, so the curve being how fast the CPI climb up as you spend and as you generate installs, is to have gone through that process of spending, right? Because this is information that the people who do spend a lot of money keep pretty tight, right? So to some degree, that's part of their competitive advantage, right? They know that, hey, if I spend $1 million on this channel, the CPI is likely to go up by X percentage. Okay. Now, in this evolving world moving forward, then I think you'll see publisher models evolve also. So again, I don't think it's going to swing as far as in the console world, but you are going to see significant capital investments by publishers in terms of games, right? So at Gree, internal games, $1 to $3 million. For the external second-party games, we would easily invest, let's say, $500,000, $1 million. Right? You'll also see, I think, dedicated publisher resources that the publishers are bringing to the table. All right, we already have an established BI system. We already have PMs who have worked on successful titles. They're going to be able to share that knowledge. These are the things that publishers are going to want to provide to attract the best developers. And also placing fewer and bigger bets, right? Because if you actually look within the App Store, especially on the grossing ranks, the transition of titles actually isn't as fast as it used to be. So if you look, let's say, a year or two ago, you would see new titles constantly popping up. Whereas nowadays, if you look at, let's say, the top 10, top 20, there's not that much transition. You might see 1 drop to 3, 5 climb up to 4, 7 to 10, but very rarely are you going to see a game just come out of the blue and take, let's say, number 5. Right? So in that world where there's not that much movement, a lot of publishers are taking smaller but bigger bets, right? Because in order to be competitive with those top games, again, the production values have to be there. They have to have the right monetization and retention features that can take time and teams to significantly build out. And then, again, on the marketing side, publishers are going to have to offer the marketing budget, the marketing coordination, and then the ability to evaluate all these marketing channels. With that package, then they can go out to the top quality developers and say, this is what we can bring to the table. And again, you guys are coming with the great ideas, with the talented teams, and really working together from there. Now, the resulting relationship in the financials then, again, I think are going to swing a little bit more towards the middle, right? It'll be earlier and deeper partnerships where if the publisher is providing some of the advances or funding, they're going to want to get engaged earlier in the game. Right? They're not going to wait until a game is almost done and then jump in. Also, more balanced risk between the developer and the publisher. So the developer might fund part of the game, the publisher might fund part of the game. And resulting, the rev shares would be in line with the budget, the risk, the knowledge contributed respectively. Right? So I would say my best guess, it'll probably settle somewhere in the 60-40 or 70-30 range, leaning towards the publisher moving forward. So having said all that, then, from a developer standpoint, what are the things that you should be looking for? Because the market is changing very rapidly, and there's lots of companies out there saying that they want to be publishers. So as a developer, then how do you screen who can actually do a good job working with me as a developer to successfully market my game, and who hasn't, and who doesn't? Right? So these are just some of the criteria. So look for a budget commitment. Right, either in terms of advances, funding that they're willing to provide, or marketing guarantees that are metrics driven. Let's say, hey, if the 30-day retention is greater than 10% and the ARPDAU is greater than 7 or 10 cents, then we'll kick in this much marketing. Right? You want them to have some skin in the game. Yeah. Dedicated PM support. So ideally, you're working with a publisher who has successfully either developed their own game or managed other developers' games from a PM perspective, so they know which are the features that work and which ones are the ones that don't. And then you get them to commit, hey, the experienced PMs are going to be working on my title with me. Okay? You don't want to work with a publisher who they have 1 PM for 20 games, right? Because just realistically, they're not going to be able to spend that much time and share that much knowledge or work closely with you. Marketing capability. So demonstrated ability to acquire users at scale. So this isn't, again, saying 1,000 users here, 2,000 users here. You want to work with a publisher who, based on their previous track record, has popped games into top 3 for a consistent period of time, right? What that demonstrates is that they have both the budget, they have the coordination skills, they have the knowledge to know how to properly market games. Right? And related closely to that is having a track record, right? Either successfully publishing their own games and having top grossing games there, or ideally, best case scenario, successfully launch a third-party game, right? Because that proves that, hey, they're able to effectively work with an external developer to develop a great game, to launch it in the market, have that kind of burst campaign, and then sustain it over time. Yeah, it might be challenging to find publishers that meet all of these, but if you're talking to publishers who don't meet most of these, I'd be somewhat hesitant to sign. Because at the end of the day, as a developer, you're investing a lot of time, you're investing a lot of effort, and there's a huge opportunity cost with going with a publisher that doesn't work out. Right. So that's it for me. Feel free to ask me any questions.